Hi, it's Barry. In our last episode on Bernard Stiegler's What Makes Life Worth Living, Stiegler references Simone Weil's ideas about attention. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to revisit our March 3rd, 2023 episode on Weil and Byung-Chul Han. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici and Barry Falk.
Hi, Michael. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Barry. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm excited to hear your thoughts on Simone Weil and her essay, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. Weil was a French philosopher, political activist, and mystic. Christian mystic, Catholic mystic, although her relation to Catholicism was French Catholicism was complicated because the situation of her life and a French life in the 1940s, which is when she lived, was obviously under Nazi-occupied France was difficult and complex, not surprisingly. Why are we focusing on this essay? Weil's religious meditation focuses on the concept of attention. And there is, in the midst of the religious meditation, there are some, I think, philosophical definitions, or there's a philosophical conception of attention. And we wanted to sort of bring that to bear. We wanted to use Weil as a way of focusing on this concept of attention, primarily because in the previous episode, the dynamics of attention, particularly the activity of the practice of multitasking, was something that Byung-Chul Han brought to focus, and we were discussing in one context. And we thought it might be interesting to do two things. Number one, already in the previous episode, when we were talking about Byung-Chul Han and the relation between boredom and attention, we had invoked the thought of Bernard Stiegler and his thoughts about attention and noesis. And we thought it might be helpful to bring in, make us a trio to think about Weil's concepts of attention and see if we can get all these thinkers, all three of these thinkers, in some sort of conversation with each other.
Yeah.
Does that sound too complicated? I hope it's not too complicated. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting.
Oh, without a question. The one thing, and you and I had spoken about this a little bit prior, but I think it's important to bring up the complication for me with creating a trio out of the duo of Han and Stiegler is the fact that Weil is, very clearly writing from a religious perspective, whereas Stiegler is not. And Han has, I think, some pretty clear spiritual overtones, perhaps, but they're not really tied to religious doctrine. Yeah. And so the thing that I struggle with this was, how can we really place Weil in conversation with Han, given that she has a very different end game, right?
Sure.
And so the thing for me that makes this possible, and I think it's important that we've classified this as a philosophical take on attention, is that while for her the end game is on a different plane, right? I mean, she's looking at God and heaven and everything.
Well, let me read the title, and I don't want to run from the title.
Right.
What I kind of did in the, and you're asking me and our listeners, viewers, to, be cognizant of the title and the aim of the essay. So I'll repeat the title. The full title is, the rather ungainly, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. So the time, and actually, partly in answering your concern and your question, let me give sort of take and see if you agree with me on that title. So, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. You're exactly right. As she sets up in the title, the discussion of attention, concentration, learning, education. We should say that attention here is also part of a larger argument about
On
what it means to
education.
study and what
Right.
education is and what it means to learn. I guess actually that might be, maybe that's a little bit of a difference between her concerns. That's another difference between, or divergence between Vey and Hahn and Stiegler. But you know, to answer your question, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. That implies that this discussion of education is under the rubric of the proper devotion to the deity, right? But I think one of the reasons why we thought this might fit, it's worthy to bring, it's valuable to bring this essay.
Well, fair to bring, I think.
Fair to bring this essay in here is that along the way, even though the title, I think, is a little bit misleading because it does sound like the discussion of education is going to be subordinated completely to the love of God, to the view of devotion. And obviously, that is a primary aim of the essay. But within it, I see, and I think this is the reason why we think it's fair to bring it in, we see kind of new content, a new philosophical content that Vey is bringing to this discussion of attention. And one last thing, a concern I had, I won't speak for you, but I think I think you agree with my concern. A concern I had with Byung-Chul Han was in his discussion of multitasking and by extension, attention in the concrete boredom section of the Burnout Society. There was a lot, and in fact, throughout that book, so really on the whole, there's a lack of practical solutions to the very real social problems and the problems of attention deficit that he's always, and of inner emptiness and, and depression and anxiety that he's constantly pointing to. And this time reading it, I was sort of impatient with the lack. Now it's a little bit unfair because I think especially when he writes that book, just delineating the problems with internet culture and digital culture and social media is, it's an important task. But reading it now in 2023, I think we were both concerned that there's a lack of, so what? Okay, I know that, or there's a frustrating feeling of, well, yeah, I know that we have a problem. How do we address this and get to possible provisional solutions? And the reason why we really brought Vey in the first place in this, the reason why we were talking about Stiegler, actually, for that matter, last time, is we were thinking that these are thinkers who address the problem of attention and attention deficit and of learning and of creativity, but seem to have more practical, I guess, more nuance, more of a sense of how to remedy the problem, as well as a diagnosis of the problem.
Yeah, I think part of that is wrapped up in their conceptions of the way that we can turn attention into something productive.
Right.
So for Han,
without it being the bad kind of productive that Byung-Chul Han talks about.
Well, no, but I think it even plays for Han. I mean, if you think about, if we line the three of them up in the order of Han, Stiegler, Vey, right? Han's attachment to boredom is a very sort of passive one, in the sense that boredom isn't something that we do anything with. We're supposed to just be bored, and out of that boredom comes some sort of enlightenment or epiphany. So I don't think that any part of his agenda is action focused. There's nothing for you to do other than to be bored. And I think that perhaps it speaks to the nature of being so plugged in that we want and feel the need to be moving or doing something, right? Stiegler is a step beyond that. For him, noesis is sort of like a stepping outside or an unplugging but that itself is a verb, right? To unplug something. There's action in what he's asking us to do so that we can, be away from what this is word reticulation, right? Like this, so that we can be unplugged literally. Wei's approach, and to get back to the question of how do we legitimize or justify a religious text with a spiritual or secular text, is that Wei's take on attention is action. It's very different in principle than what Han is asking. Han is saying, look, you need to be bored. You need to not be doing all this stuff. Wei gives us a sort of code, or a means of being.
Yeah, ethic, a way to behave,
and
practice.
So so for her, attention is so the attention that yields the right way of doing things, right? Which for her is prayer, but it's still a thing here. Is
and a couple different things. It
yes,
require prayer in her terminology, which I think is kind of a new terminology.
It is.
It takes certain steps.
It does, but it's also very, very intentional. Where
Absolutely.
I think that your frustration and mine from last time talking about Han was, it was like, okay, dude, so what now? And the answer literally just seemed to be, well, this is it. Now to really, really debase this, he's basically asking you to be Bill and Ted sitting on the curb outside the Circle K waiting for Rufus to show up, right?
Is that fair? It's a good thing. It's saying it's a good thing because that you're waiting because you're bored.
Yes, and that means that things can happen to you.
Things can happen to you. In fact, if you linger in the boredom, it's going to be okay. Bill and Ted will arrive.
You can save the world. You can save the world.
You can save the world. You can save the world.
So my job here is done. I've plugged the Bill and Ted reference. I don't know that I have anything else to do.
I think mic drop.
That's it.
Literally.
Yes. So that's how I think that's the sort of the intersection that I think is interesting to explore, is how Han leaves us with this. The goal is the same, right? The goal is some sort of productive end game, a creative end game. And they both agree that to do that, you have to not be caught up in all the flotsam and jetsam of this busy, connected world. What's interesting for Wei again, though, is that she's very analog. This was written in the early 40s. Right. We don't have an internet. I mean, she's not plugged in. She's literally not plugged in.
But she still feels, well, this is an interesting thing to pose, especially against Byung-Chul Han, because Byung-Chul Han definitely assumes a periodization. His whole book is about the Burnout Society as a whole book is about a new periodization. We're moving away from the age of discipline. There's a historical argument, right? Or a description of historical change, that we're moving away. Now with the internet, we're in the burnout society, and that productivity has a new kind of function in the new post-disciplinary society. So there's a historical argument here. See what you think of this. I mean, I take your point, and I like your point that that Wei is writing in a real analog society. But don't you think Pache Han, Contra Han, don't you think the implication in her essay is that it's just as easy to be distracted in the analog society as it is in the burnout society? I mean, Byung-Chul Han is arguing that there's a kind of new urgency or a new prevalence, that burnout is a mass phenomenon because of the mass communication technology of the internet. But I sense that Wei thinks there's a kind of natural danger to squander your attention. It has nothing to do with technology. Am I right? What do you think?
Without question. In fact, the question I would ask is that and I don't want to get us distracted here.
But were you punning? Was that an intentional pun?
Oh my God, no. Sorry.
You don't want to. I don't want to
want to send us down a rabbit hole. But I'm wondering if answer this for me. How fair is it to really group Wei and Han together, and are these concerns and solutions really apples to apples, given the fact that Han is looking at an entirely new level of distractions and interactions? Yes, Wei is very clearly saying that, look, in this analog world, there are natural distractions akin to your
Absolutely.
mind wandering, right?
Right.
But I wonder, in Han's world, or in our world, which is Han's world, right, with literally 360, 5 degrees of or 360, whoops, I can't even figure this out, with a full circle of degrees of distraction around us, with 360 degrees of distraction in all ways, is it fair? I guess what I'm saying is, given the scope of things to attend to now, I wonder if the answer of boredom, I wonder if there's even room to focus on being not distracted.
I have an answer that will be controversial. I have an answer to that, or I have a personal, a better way to put it. I don't have an answer, but I have an answer that works for me on this. But I sense it will be controversial to you and to any of our listeners and viewers that have like a modicum of good sense. But here I am behind the mic, so I'm going to tell you my answer to that, because I do have a take on it. Maybe I should say I have a take that might infuriate many people because it's going to seem very counterintuitive, or maybe it's going to seem reactionary, but why not? So here's my answer. I think what you're asking, and it's a great question, and I don't think it's too much going down the rabbit hole to discuss this a bit. I think you're channeling what Byung-Chul Han might say if he knew of our podcast and said, hey, he might call foul, because he might indeed say, you're comparing a meditation on attention when I am clearly talking about a rupture in time. That's the argument behind that he makes very clear is the argument for the Burnout Society. There has been a rupture in time. The rupture in time, we're in a new kind of social order, new rules, and to a certain extent, what attention means and how to preserve it, it's a different dynamic here because there's been a rupture. Okay, now here's my controversial response to that.
Yeah.
My controversial personal response to that gets to another criticism, a latent criticism that I don't think I articulated or thought, in my own head until you said it. One of my worries about Byung-Chul Han is, granted, we wouldn't have this effing podcast if we didn't believe there was something qualitatively new about 2023, about internet in 2023. We wouldn't have this podcast. So we're on board with him. Still in all, I feel that Byung-Chul Han, and he's not alone in this, maybe overstates the case. That maybe he thinks that human nature changed more than it has. Or maybe, put it this way, if we had the apocalypse and an internet shutdown, maybe Byung-Chul Han too blithely assumes that human nature, maybe he too blithely assumes a kind of malleability or perfectibility of humankind. So that if you just got rid of Twitter, you just got rid of TikTok, we would solve our attention problems. And I kind of find it a salutary reminder that, even if we outlawed or banned TikTok, as people are talking of doing, right? Even if we did that, we would still kind of have the problem of attention in some form or other.
So here's one for you. And I think we're working backwards. I think we're working our way back to Wei, perhaps. One of the things.
Are you irritated and angry at my remark?
No, but I'm
worried that. Yeah.
No. But I'm
gonna
gonna play a game with that for a second.
Please.
And this is really sort of a subject object question, which is, you know, one of the things that I dig into.
That's one of the things you do. I guess what I was asking is, have I offended you, Michael? This has
No,
been
no,
something
by no means,
I
by no
offended
means.
you.
I think it's a good point. And so I'll step back away. So I'm looking at this chronologically. Okay.
Okay,
So
please.
if Vey's writing in the 40s, right?
Mhm,
And Hahn is contemporary.
mhm.
Stiegler was writing in the 80s, 90s. What we're referencing?
Well, I mean, he's writing, I guess a lot of the books are in the 90s and aughts.
Okay, so yes, yes, I'm sorry, that's right. So the question I
And I
have
think
though,
they know each other. I think they knew each other. We're embarrassed. We need a fact checker on this, but I think that they're aware of each other's work.
well, here's the question I would have for you.
Hahn and Stiegler.
For Stiegler, noesis is the thing that we need in order to be noesis begets creativity, right?
Right.
And the key to a noetic moment is to step outside
Mhm,
of that of the busyness of life,
mhm.
and to
Through
forge
mental activities that don't seem to be at first sight productive, right?
amateurism.
Amateurism,
And
of
this is
course.
what
Thank you.
this is
Yeah.
where I start to wonder about
Mhm,
your TikTok, for example, or your
mhm,
any sort of creation
mhm,
that functions as a distraction for the
mhm,
viewer.
mhm,
But I wonder if Hahn would consider the creation of these distractions a creative act. And so this gets to saying, well, if we're in this new era,
hmm,
this we
mhm,
have this rupture in time where we're now in this new era and we are literally so beset by distractions
mhm,
that the answer to coping with them and then towards having creative moments is just boredom, to be over and done and past these things so that we don't have them, you know, as active participants in our consciousness. I wonder if it's not some sort of vicious circle where
hmm.
you know, this creative moment manifests itself in the production of artifacts that then become distractions for other things. And so I'm wondering if Stiegler might call that creativity, right? Like, which side of the coin are we looking at? And so for both of them, the idea is to step outside. For Stiegler, the idea is that you should indulge in something, but it has to be not serious, not productive in terms of, you know, how do I want to say this? You got to have to help me out with this a little bit. But Stiegler's approach to noesis is amateurism, or that's one of the routes.
And that's something he has really in common. The more you talk about it, that's something that that connects to one of the most surprising for a religious meditation on education. That ties in directly with the concluding movement of the reflections essay, because she is at pains to say that even though attention is arduous, waiting can be arduous
Mm-hmm.
or requires an act of will, that the end product has to be joy and pleasure, the kind of joys and pleasures in activity that you do when you're off the clock, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
When you're engaging in an amateur activity for the love of it, right?
Right. Right.
Amateur. You're indulging in an activity for the love of it. I mean, that's a very helpful side move, Michael, because that really connects us. You made me see a connection between Weil and Stiegler that I hadn't was totally missed. In his elevation, in Stiegler's elevation of amateurism, what does he like about amateurism? You're doing it for the love of it, and
Right.
that's exactly Weil's concluding point. That the end point of this is not to be. It's not asceticism, even though it's tied to the view to the proper love of God. The end point is, in Weil's view, is joy, and the
Mm-hmm.
joy you get when you're doing things you love to do.
Right. The object of that love is just
Exactly.
different. So that's the, I guess,
Well, I didn't mean to digress you. You were talking about amateurism and Stiegler with a view to go somewhere else.
No, I think that you got me where I was. I think that you got me where I was trying to get, and probably got me there much more quickly than I would have without that. So I guess that's my question though about Han. Is that have we crossed over something? This was supposed to be the episode on Simone Weil. We are spending quite a bit of time discussing Han here, which I think is fun.
Luckily, your last comment got me to mention, and I don't know, we might have not mentioned it earlier, but it's really important that, reflections on the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God. This sounds like this could be really painful.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the thrust.
It's joyful. It's joyful.
It's about joy. It's about amateurism. The fun of amateurism is that you're off the clock. You're doing it because you love to do it. Even if you get paid for it, it's not the point. By the way, I would also just one sentence or two about the difference between Stiegler and maybe Byung-Chul Han, which is, I think, where you were going. When you were talking about TikTok, and well, I don't want to distract you where you're going. I'll make a point that I wanted to return to TikTok and Stiegler, but I don't want to keep you from where you're going. So if I have a chance to insert it, fine. If not, not. So I'll let you
go ahead.
Well, when you were describing about, I was going to partly agree with you and partly not disagree, but just sort of push it in another direction. When you were talking about, you posed a couple of very interesting questions. One of them was, might Byung-Chul Han, or should Byung-Chul Han regard the creativity, and maybe should Stiegler regard the kind of creativity that goes into constructing a cool meme or a cool TikTok? Should they consider that as really creative activity and aligned in some way akin to noesis, regardless of the use value, regardless of how this product is consumed and circulates? And
can you repeat that? Repeat that.
Well, I was just trying to restate your question, so maybe I didn't recognize your question. So you tell me if I'm getting it right. I thought you were pointing out. I thought the point of you mentioned TikTok, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought your point in that is saying you kind of have to be creative and noetic to make a TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my response to that, channeling the other thinkers we've been talking about, not they, but channeling Byung-Chul Han and Stiegler. My answer to that is probably in both cases, certainly in Stiegler's case, Stiegler's inner Marxist would probably rise to the fore or come to the fore in describing TikTok, and say that it doesn't matter if there's noesis at the front end. The way that the masses encounter TikTok is as a commodity that's designed to make you waste your time.
I think Stiegler would argue that it's a one-way door.
It's a one-way door, exactly. Yeah.
And I think that Han, and here I think maybe Han and Weil converge here a little bit. Han, I think, would argue that watching the TikTok, engaging with, and it doesn't have to be TikTok. I mean, it could be anything, right?
Okay, I got you.
Is going to be the kind of thing that will get in the way as long as we're actually paying attention to it, right? If you can be, if you're truly bored and it's playing, it doesn't matter. It does not have your attention. You can then be productive out of that boredom. That boredom clears a space, if you will. So here, I think they was very clearly talking about TikTok when she says, above all, our thought should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object which is to penetrate it. All wrong translations, all absurdities in geometry programs, all clumsiness of style, and all faulty connection of ideas in compositions and essays. All such things are due to the fact that thought has seized upon some idea too hastily, and thus being prematurely blocked is not open to the truth. So you know, the argument that she seems to be making here is that the way to the truth, to creativity, to the right way of doing things has to be unencumbered by an objective, by some sort of conscious decision that things should be this way or that way. So in a way, I think that, you know, Han and Vey, could make, you know, fantastic social media posts and memes and videos together, as long as they just don't give a shit what they look like in the end.
That could be. That could be. I like that idea. I love the idea of Vey TikTok. There definitely should be a Vey TikTok. In fact, we're going to do that. We're going to stop this episode right now and start working on that.
That's right.
I'm going to push back on that a little
Okay.
bit. I'm going to push back on that just from my own experience of TikTok. I think.
Well, let me say one thing before you push back.
Please.
Just to clarify what I'm saying, it's when she says all wrong translations, absurdities, clumsiness. The way I'm reading that is to say that when you become too deliberate, in other words, you're trying too hard. These become stylistic concerns for her. Right? That it's clumsy, it's awkward, it doesn't fit. That real, genuine, productive creativity cannot be trying to fit a certain mold.
I wasn't going to push back against that, because I think that is a great. I was going to push back on the idea that that argument. Absolutely, that's a great description of her ideas about the goals of thinking. And the goals of attention. I wasn't pushing back against that, but I do feel what I was pushing back against was too lingering an equation of what Vey is talking about with TikTok, because there's something primary about TikTok, my experience of it, that makes it antithetical to what Vey is talking about. And I'll tell you what it is and see if you agree. Now you're like a TikTok virgin, right? You don't have any.
I don't think I've ever actually seen.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So,
which is what I'm laughing at as we're going through this.
Yeah, it's like, oh, we're talking about TikTok. I don't. That's
how I can tell you that I watch all of Simone Weil's TikToks, because I've watched every single one of them.
Yeah. But I think I think that's a wrong description of what happens on TikTok.
Okay, well,
and but it might be worth saying why I think it's wrong.
Sure. And watch me push back against it, having absolutely no knowledge of what I'm talking about.
That's going to be the fun. I think that and this I feel I think they would take this negatively. Would feel this is a negative experience. In TikTok, you're not really lingering in your boredom.
No, they're short, right?
They're short. They're incredibly short. And so time isn't so much. Oh, go ahead.
Well, just a quick question for you, though. I'm not looking at this as an individual creation. I'm looking at this as a platform. Okay. And so for me, because I lied, I have seen TikTok. I've just never actually lingered.
I mean, if you've been on other platforms now,
my wife will show me from time to time. She'll like look at this thing. But the point is, it's not. It's like saying so. Take a different platform for a second, right? Okay. You can look at something like Instagram, and you can look at one particular person's Instagram feed, or you can just get sucked into the whole of Instagram,
it. Yeah. Okay.
Where you're beset with one thing after the next, after the next, after the next. And it all becomes sort of this larger experience of this platform. And in that regard, I think that you can look at this and say, well, there is a style or a theme to this. There's a way of doing this properly. There's a way of doing this improperly. There's certainly a way to be bored with this. In fact, I would argue one of the hallmarks of these platforms is that they are incredibly, incredibly boring, yet somehow they just suck you in. So it's this non-Han boredom where you can't pull away.
Right.
But there's absolutely nothing useful coming out of it.
once you shifted from TikTok to description of other platforms, my pushback fell away, because I think that's, and in fact, you just said what I think they would, her criticism or her unease with all the platforms, is that they're boring, but they're addictive in a particular way. This is really okay. This is true for me on TikTok. This was what I was about to say, but as you were just suggesting, it might be generally true of all social media platforms. They're boring, but you stick with them. They're addictive because they're boring. Because, especially with TikTok, but I think this is kind of implicit everywhere. You think the next one I get to,
it's lotto.
Is going to be the money.
It's lottery.
That's the money. That's the lottery. So it's money, the next one I get to. And so that's what you're addicted to. That's not emptiness. And as you say, I thought you weren't saying that, but you were saying that. Mm-hmm. So we're in total agreement. And I think that would be on what I think they would be hesitant about in social media phenomenon. Yes, it's boring. And Byung-Chul Han too, I guess. Yes, it's boring, but it's not a creative boredom. Why? Because you are always convincing yourself that the next one will be gold.
Or at least worth your time.
So you're in search of that fix.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting, we don't need to go down this road, but it's interesting how it resembles a fix and how it also diverges from a fix. Because with a fix, one assumes if you have good stuff, it's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
That you might perpetually be searching for a fix if you're doing the social media scroll.
Mm-hmm. And so the difference here then, I guess, if we can bring our three contestants back in, right, is bring them back in, right? Stiegler would argue, look, you got to step away. You got to put your phone down, right? That if you want to be creative, you have to step outside of this connection and sort of go play the tuba somewhere. Play it poorly, but play it because you love it.
I agree.
Right? Han would argue that maybe you don't need to step away from it, but you need to just be you need to be willing to not attend to it. You need to get to a place where you're bored to the point where you're no longer seeking that fix. Right? You can just be indifferent to whatever's like, sort of glass over, if you will. In this sort of scenario that we've created, right? Wei's looking at this maybe and saying, you have to be very, very careful about what you're looking at. You have to choose to ignore certain things that don't serve your ends. You can't actually have an end. You have to be open. You have to be open.
But what you just said was really important. What did you say? That, you can't have an end, but right before that, you said something. That you have to be searching for the right thing, something like that.
You have to be open to the right thing.
You have to be open to the right thing. I want to return to that because I think that's my takeaway from Wei.
Well, that's sort of what I'm trying to work out here, right? Is that for Wei, you have to be open to whatever this inspiration is going to bring you. You can't search for a particular inspiration because now you're tied to the wrong things. You're leading the charge, and you can't be generative of the thing, right? There's a massive distinction between what we are and what God is, and anything that comes from us is definitely not God if it comes from us. Therefore, it's the wrong thing. So to put Wei in front of a social media feed, right? You have to be careful what you attend to. You have to be deliberate in your focus.
Deliberate, willful, yes.
Right? There's a right way of doing this, but do we ever figure out what that right way is other than just to be open to what is not from you?
I think by definition, she cannot say what that right way is because she doesn't want to prescribe.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense.
And that makes sense. I'm ready to give a takeaway that actually that relates totally to what you just said about.
Okay. What you got?
But before we do that, in our waning moments here, I don't know if we want to talk about this now. but maybe this is something I want to tag for another episode. In fact, I think I don't want to talk about this now. I'm going to raise it, but then I'm going to forget to talk about it. But I wanted to tag it here in public in this conversation. The more we've talked a lot about Stiegler in this episode.
Mhm.
And, as we've been talking about Stiegler, we've both been using the terms, he wants you to step outside, to critically step outside. We invoked his championing of amateur activities. And boy, look at the title of Vey's essay, another connection between amateur, ammo, love of the lover of things. And then again, Vey, direct connection, reflections on the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God. So there's a big convergence here. So as we've been talking, so we bring in Stiegler in ways that I've been surprised about how much we brought Stiegler in here and how relevant he seems to Vey. But we've been assuming that he asks us to unplug. And the more we talk about that, I'm trying to think of specific references. I think we use that term, that he asks us to step outside and to unplug. Yes, he talks about amateur and champions. I think that's the right word, amateur activity. But does he ever tell us to get off the internet?
No,
To become a Unabomber?
no,
Does he ever
I don't think so.
Unabomber, I don't mean to say that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like to detach, to purge,
To
to
fully,
whatever.
fully separate yourself.
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
don't think so. I think that,
That's
and I,
worth remarking, if so, right?
yeah,
That's worth remarking.
I don't think that's part of his solution. I think that we read Stiegler with Crary, and so those two kind of get me crossed up a little bit. But if I recall correctly, Stiegler's argument was more about the connections among everything and the need to sort of divest yourself from some of those connections because it creates a feedback, a loop that becomes toxic. I don't think that No, I don't think that he's looking at fully unplugging. I think that he's looking at sort of disrupting.
I think he's looking at disruptive practices, alternative currents of thought, like you're saying. And I think it's in that context that he presents the idea of amateurism and the ideal of amateurism activity. Like one of his examples, so this won't be too abstract for listeners, viewers, is like the amateur filmmaker. He talks about the factory in the north of France. I can't remember the region, but he talks about how they got film equipment, and they sort of became on in their off time amateur, i.e., almost professional, like expert filmmakers and documentarians, and it's that kind of activity of work practices. And this is another thing that work practices that he's interested in. That's another convergence with Vey, because there isn't a board in Hahn. There's a kind of boredom work binary, and here, and I think in Vey and in Stiegler, I think there's this idea that work, properly defined, like the work of the amateur, that's a positive thing. That isn't boring. That is the right use of attention.
Yeah, Vey doesn't worry about boredom. She worries about distract. In fact, quite the opposite. She worries about distraction that takes you away from the right way of doing things. But there's never this moment of inaction or inactivity. There is always a focus and a sense of movement in either the right direction or the wrong direction. But there's no stopping here.
Well said. Okay.
So what's your takeaway? Or was that?
Let's do it. Yeah, no, no, that was a digression. It had to do with Stiegler, but my takeaway is directly related to your point prior to the Stiegler discussion thread. I just want to draw attention to what you were drawing attention to in Vey, The deliberate character of attention. That's another thing she brings to the table that's not there in the Byung-Chul Han thing, that the kinds of attention that she wants to describe, that she wants to deem proper, it's accompanied by other patterns of thought. And here's just a passage from very near the beginning of her essay. When we set out, and it has to do with the intentionality, the deliberateness that you were speaking of, that you thought was, there and present in Wei's phenomenology of attention in distraction. When we set out to do a piece of work, it is necessary to wish to do it correctly. So that wish is prior to everything.
Mhm.
And it's a specific wish. I want to do this work. She doesn't shy away from the idea that it's work.
No.
She just doesn't want to say it's not painful. She wants to say, she says study is work, but it's not painful labor. When we set out to do a piece of work, if we do it right, when we set out to do a piece of work, it is necessary, as a preliminary, I read it, it is necessary to wish to do it correctly, because, yes, it is a necessary preliminary, because such a wish to do it correctly is indispensable in any true effort. That's kind of, that's her contribution to this subject, this idea of a kind of willful paradox. It's a paradox, right? Because you're trying to reach this empty state, this vacuum state, but you have to go into it with a very concerted wish to elevate yourself and to do the thing correctly, to do whatever is at hand. And that's one at hand. Excuse me. This very deliberate wish to do whatever it is that you need to do correctly. That's very much part of her front loading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you go even in that same paragraph, you just follow her 2 sentences further. Underlying this immediate objective, however, our deep purpose should aim solely at increasing the power of attention with a view to prayer. As when we write, we draw the shape of the letter on paper, not with the view to its shape, but with the view to the idea we want to express. So for her, it's not, I want to get the job done in this very quick, immediate, sort of,
I'm not getting the job done. I'm getting the job done correctly.
Yeah, it's not about mass production. It's about the view to the idea we want to express. And I think this gets us back to our inner desire, our concerns. What are we trying to do? This idea of amateurism or love again. Yeah,
exactly. That's where I was going. It gets us back to Stiegler's notion of the amateur and how the amateur works. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe last point, just because we didn't talk about it. But this is really kind of key to this, gives you a sense of her project in the essay. The aim of increasing attention in our school studies. She's very adamant. She doesn't want to make great mathematicians or writers or whatever.
No, that is a secondary, tertiary concern at best.
Tertiary concern. What she's concerned with is this practice of attention. And what she says often, early and often in the essay, I don't care what you're paying attention to. You can always use this method and activate this particular understanding of attention. Always. Regardless of the subject.
Well said. Barry,
visual gestures here.
Yes,
for those translate very well on Spotify.
For those of you listening, throw your arms in the air. Barry, as always, I think this has been fun. This was the sort of smorgasbord episode. This was not the Simone Weil episode that you had introduced. This was the attention episode.
It was the attention deficit episode. Michael, did you have a takeaway, or I think you gave your takeaway though.
No, my takeaway is that the distinctions between Han and Weil and Stiegler are not nearly what I guess coming in, I was looking at Han arguing that we need boredom, which was this sort of contextual occurrence, if you will, and Weil arguing that we need this focused attention, which is the result of certain very deliberate actions. And I think that when you sort of extrapolate what each means, there's less difference than I had suspected originally. It was kind of an interesting happenstance of this discussion.
And my real takeaway for this episode, very briefly, is yours. I especially saw a convergence. I was surprised by convergences, which I didn't expect. And I'm totally I have to go away and ponder the convergence between Stiegler and Weil, because I thought of the two, that's the biggest gap between the two thoughts and practices. I went into this thinking Stiegler and Weil, because of Stiegler's secularism, I was thinking I wasn't going to find a point of convergence, but actually the amateurism, boy, that's a point of convergence and coincidence between the things.
Yeah, this was fun. This was fun. All right. Well, we hope you've had fun too. And
share, dislike, dissuade,
disapprove.
They should have a disapprove button, right, on Spotify or YouTube. We disapprove of this. Dislike is too weak. Too weak.
What would that look like? Instead of the thumbs up, would it just be the middle finger? Like
middle finger.
Okay,
well, vulgarly disapprove.
Let less this conclusion become distracting. Barry, thank you, and God knows where we'll pick up next time.
And we'll do this again somehow, some way.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.